services for Palestinians in Gaza, the fabric of society have been decimated. Conditions of life, particularly in northern Gaza, are increasingly not fit for survival. Mr. President, turning specifically to the situation in northern Gaza, the latest report from the respected and independent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, warns there is a strong likelihood that famine is imminent. This horrific possibility cannot be separated from the unrelenting attacks on the human rights of civilians there. Over the past 5 weeks, the Israeli military has conducted strikes that have led to massive civilian fatalities in northern Gaza, particularly impacting women, children, older people, the sick, and people with disabilities, many of whom are reportedly trapped by Israeli military restrictions and attacks on escape routes. The pattern and the frequency of these reported attacks suggest the systematic targeting of locations known or which should have been known as sheltering significant numbers of civilians, coupled with the continued use of weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We have warned repeatedly that this has led to disproportionate civilian fatalities. The Israeli military has also conducted repeated attacks on the 3 major hospitals in the area and on other vital infrastructure, while unlawfully restricting the entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance to northern Gaza. Already, OHCHR has documented how by April of this year, the severe restrictions imposed by Israel on the entry and distribution of goods and services necessary for the survival of the civilian population brought the risk of famine and starvation to Gaza. We again recall that the use of starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. Just recently, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a detailed analysis of violations between November 2023 and April 2024. The report's conclusions call for a reckoning with the serious allegations of violations of international law. The manner in which the Israeli military is conducting operations in northern Gaza suggests not only that Israel's actions are seeking to empty northern Gaza of Palestinians by displacing survivors to the south, but points to further grave risks of atrocities of the most serious nature. Palestinian armed groups must also comply with international humanitarian law, including refraining from deliberately co-locating military objectives with civilians and civilian infrastructure, and must take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population under their control from the effects of attacks. In General Assembly Resolution ES 10/24, Israel must end its continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. The only sustainable solution to this conflict is by forging a path that gives Palestinians and Israelis the chance to live side by side in peace, equality, and dignity. Thank you.
Thank Ms. Brans-Keres for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Lane Paulson.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the food security situation in northern Gaza is dire, and the latest indications are deeply troubling. Already in October, nearly 133,000 people faced catastrophic food insecurity, and the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification released on 17th of October warned that under a reasonable worst-case scenario, a risk of famine existed for the whole of the Gaza Strip between November 2024 and April 2025. It also projected the population classified in IPC Phase 5, that is catastrophe, would nearly triple in the coming months. As emphasized by ASG Keres, there is nothing reasonable in what has unfolded in recent weeks. The conflict has intensified, and so has the damage to objects indispensable to civilian survival. Last Friday, the Independent Famine Review Committee issued an alert following significant developments since the conclusion of the last IPC analysis. The Famine Review Committee has found a strong likelihood that famine is occurring or imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. Men, women, boys, and girls are effectively starving as the conflict rages, with humanitarian organizations blocked from delivering assistance to those in need. Excellencies, agri-food systems have collapsed in the Gaza Strip. Local food production has been decimated. Recent geospatial analyses indicate that nearly 70% of the cropland, which has contributed up to 1/3 of daily consumption, has been damaged or destroyed since the escalation in hostilities started last year. Likewise, animal production has been devastated, with almost 95% of cattle and more than half of sheep and goat herds now dead. These animal losses have both removed access to critical and nutritious sources of protein and milk, as well as devastated people's livelihoods. The satellite images from recent geospatial assessments indicate that heavy vehicle tracks, razing, shelling, and other conflict-related pressures have damaged large areas of farmland, infrastructure, wells, and other productive infrastructure for agricultural activities in the Gaza Strip. Khan Yunis has the largest and most impacted cultivated area in terms of surface area, while North Gaza has the highest proportion of damage per governorate. It is important to highlight that prior to the 7th of October 2023, Gaza was largely self-sufficient in vegetables, eggs, fresh milk, poultry, and fish. Local agriculture also produced much of the red meat and fresh fruits consumed inside Gaza. Domestic production of these fresh, nutritious, but perishable foods meant that Gazan children's nutritional outcomes were similar to those of children in middle-income countries, despite high levels of food insecurity. Local agriculture is first and foremost crucial for providing balanced nutrition for the entire population. It is also a source of income and provides a dignified life for those working in the agricultural and food production sector. A functioning local agri-food system is crucial to minimize the concerning levels of acute food insecurity and malnutrition across the Gaza Strip. The significant levels of damage to agri-food systems are exacerbating the humanitarian and hunger crisis on the ground and increasing the risk of famine. Food supply across the entire Gaza Strip has sharply deteriorated, while food availability is at an all-time low. Excellencies, when people cannot produce or access food, they will suffer increasingly extreme levels of acute malnutrition. People in Gaza have been experiencing this for more than a year. This is the 5th time that the Famine Review Committee has met in 1 year, a first in the history of the IPC classification, on the situation in the Gaza Strip. We can and must save lives. This is a humanitarian imperative, and it is our moral responsibility. People urgently need food, water, medical aid, and other essential humanitarian assistance. By the time famine has been declared, people are already dying of hunger, with irreversible consequences that can last generations. The window of opportunity to deliver this assistance is now, today, not tomorrow. Alongside food assistance, agricultural aid is vitally needed to restore availability of highly nutritious food, prevent the sector's total collapse, preserve remaining agricultural livelihoods, and curb acute hunger and malnutrition. Gaza's farmers, fishers, and livestock owners are risking their lives to continue production. But this is becoming impossible due to the restrictions and bans on imports of food production inputs and the substantial damages suffered by production infrastructure. FAO is ready to further scale up its efforts to respond to and mitigate famine and prevent its spread in the Gaza Strip through additional support for remaining livestock and to enable local food production where possible. Today, we renew the call for urgent diplomatic efforts from across the international community to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including famine in the Gaza Strip, and for Council members to remind all parties to the conflict of their responsibility to protect civilian infrastructure critical to the delivery of humanitarian aid and to ensure the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets in situations of armed conflict, in respect to adhering to obligations under international humanitarian law. Immediate and unlimited safe access to people who are in need is indispensable to save lives and prevent famine. A ceasefire is urgently needed. We cannot forget that peace is a prerequisite for food security, and the right to food is a fundamental human right. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Paulson for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Misua.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the catastrophic situation in Gaza. Thank you also to our colleagues from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Food and Agriculture Organization. We unequivocally share the serious concerns they have expressed today. Since the escalation of this conflict in October 2023, we have briefed this Council on no fewer than 16 occasions. We have condemned the death, destruction, and dehumanization of civilians in Gaza who have been driven from their homes, stripped of their sense of place and dignity, forced to witness their family members killed, burned, and buried alive. Injured children have had the words "wounded child," "no surviving family" penned on their arms. Most of Gaza is now a wasteland of rubble. What distinction was made and what precautions were taken if more than 70% of civilian housing is either damaged or destroyed? Essential commercial goods and services, including electricity, have been all but cut off. This has led to increasing hunger, starvation, and now, as we have heard, potentially famine. We are witnessing acts reminiscent of the gravest international crimes. Mr. President, the latest offensive that Israel started in North Gaza last month is an intensified, extreme, and accelerated version of the horrors of the past year. Shelters, homes, and schools have been burned and bombed to the ground. Numerous families remain trapped under rubble because fuel for digging equipment is being blocked by the Israeli authorities, and first responders have been blocked from reaching them. Ambulances have been destroyed, and hospitals have come under attack. Supplies to the north are being cut off, and people are being pushed farther south. The daily cruelty we see in Gaza seems to have no limits. Beit Hanun has been besieged for more than 1 month. Yesterday, food and water reached shelters, but today, Israeli soldiers forcibly displaced people from those same areas. People under siege now tell us they are afraid that they will be targeted if they receive help. As I brief you, Israeli authorities are blocking humanitarian assistance from entering North Gaza, where fighting continues and around 75,000 people remain with dwindling water and food supplies. Conditions of life across Gaza are unfit for human survival. Food is insufficient. Shelter items needed ahead of winter are in extremely short supply. Violent armed lootings of our convoys have become increasingly organized along routes from Kerem Shalom, driven by the collapse of public order and safety. Many food assistance kitchens have been forced to close. In October, daily food distribution shrunk by nearly 25% compared to September. These are not logistical problems. They can be solved with the right political will. The Israeli military's announcement that the Kissul film crossing into central Gaza has opened cannot come soon enough. However, our capacity to respond is being undermined, including by the Israeli Knesset legislation to ban UNRWA activities starting in January. If implemented, this bill will be another devastating blow to efforts to provide life-saving aid and avert the threat of famine. No other organization can fill these gaps. Mr. President, we also remain concerned about the deteriorating situation of Palestinians in the West Bank. Israeli forces continue to employ lethal tactics that appear to defy law enforcement standards, and they're causing damage to water and sewage networks and other infrastructure. The demolition of Palestinian-owned homes also continues. On 5th November, 9 homes were demolished in the Silwan area outside Jerusalem's Old City, displacing 42 people, nearly half of them children, to make way for an illegal settlement-related project. Israeli settlers continue attacks on Palestinians and their property, with more than 160 incidents related to the olive harvest documented in October alone, the majority resulting in casualties or property damage. Movement restrictions are making civilian access to essential services, particularly healthcare, increasingly challenging in refugee camps and in Area C, where humanitarian partners are scaling up to support communities in meeting needs. Mr. President, the most basic requirements of humanity are being disregarded. These are requirements that members of this Council, and indeed all member states, set out in international humanitarian and human rights law. They must be respected. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians throughout military operations. Civilians must be allowed to seek protection elsewhere, and they must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return as international law demands. Reports indicating that people would not be allowed to return should be of grave concern to this Council. Parties must ensure that civilians' essential needs are met and must facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are. Hostages and those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately, and in the interim, they must be treated humanely and allowed visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Indiscriminate rocket fire towards Israel must stop. There must be accountability for international crimes. The provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in the case on the application of the Genocide Convention in the Gaza Strip and the determinations in its advisory opinion of July 2024 must be implemented now. Mr. President, now is the time for member states to use their leverage to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law through diplomatic and economic pressure, responsible arms transfer, and combating impunity. Now is the time for the Security Council to use its powers under the UN Charter to ensure compliance with international law and full implementation of its resolutions. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msua for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Thanks to ASG Brands Kellis and Acting USG Msua and Director Poulsen for their briefings. Colleagues, Gaza is in the grip of a humanitarian catastrophe with over 43,000 Palestinians killed, hospitals and roads destroyed, and winter approaching. We must see an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages. Ending the war is the best way to stop the suffering. The humanitarian situation is intolerable, and we need to act immediately to improve it. Aid deliveries last month were the lowest since the conflict began, and now imminent famine looms over northern Gaza, while food and other life-saving supplies are stuck at the border. This is appalling. It is completely unacceptable that trucks, humanitarian workers, and medics, funded by the international community, are unable to travel the last few miles to reach civilians. The Famine Review Committee has issued a shocking and urgent warning, one which Israel must heed and act on today. As the committee put it, it is abundantly clear that a worst-case scenario is now playing out in the areas of northern Gaza, where starvation, malnutrition, and deaths are believed to be rising fast. Colleagues, time has run out, and urgent solutions are required now to prevent the very worst from unfolding. There is no excuse for the Israeli government's ongoing restrictions on humanitarian assistance. They fly in the face of Israel's public commitments. So let me be clear. My government condemns these restrictions in the strongest terms. So we are calling on Israel to finally and immediately make good on its commitment to flood Gaza with aid. We want to see greater variety and quantity of essential items surging in, including food, water, fuel, and medicine. Israel must urgently enable safe and effective aid distribution. This includes repairing roads to deliver aid and enabling continuous access to northern Gaza from southern Gaza. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Evacuation orders should be rescinded as soon as possible so families can return home. And humanitarians must be able to work safely and effectively. The United Nations and its agencies must be able to fulfill their mandate. UNRWA remains the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and provides essential basic services. The international community has been clear that Israel must not undermine its role and must meet all legal obligations.
By the IPC and its Famine Review Committee provide the harrowing details of what innocent civilians, many of them hapless children and infants, are enduring in Gaza. The entire population is experiencing emergency levels of acute food insecurity. Should this conflict continue to intensify and expand, coupled with the non-entry of humanitarian goods and evacuation orders, there is a risk of famine for the entire Gaza Strip. In northern Gaza, several areas have been under siege since the beginning of October, and according to the FRC, famine is most likely imminent. All of this is man-made, Mr. President, and should spur this Council to immediate action to halt this systematic and calculated annihilation of innocent Palestinian civilians by starvation. Guyana listened carefully to the briefers today, and what we heard further reinforced the conclusion expressed on many other occasions that the apocalyptic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is entirely attributable to the persistent violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. This is evidenced by the non-compliance with the resolutions adopted by this Council, which all member states are duty-bound to comply with, and the order of provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice in January, March, and May. Guyana therefore reiterates its call to the government of Israel, the occupying power, whose responsibility it is to ensure the well-being of the Palestinian people, to immediately cease these violations of its legal obligations. Mr. President, in this context, Guyana has taken note of several extremely concerning trends that have been highlighted in the FRC report. These either contribute to the state of food insecurity in the Gaza Strip or intersect with contributing factors to further exacerbate the problem. First, the repeated evacuation orders in the north since last October. Reports also indicate that with the intensification of fighting in the north, many civilians were trapped in their homes, unable to leave. Further, some attempting to leave were reportedly being shot at. Second, the number of aid shipments being allowed into Gaza is currently at its lowest since October 2023. The weekly updates provided by OCHA show that denials of requests for humanitarian access, as well as incidents of impeded access, are significantly high, while the number of requests facilitated continues to dwindle. Consequently, though humanitarian assistance is available, it is not allowed to reach civilians who are in desperate need. Third, as civilians waste away from hunger, malnutrition, and disease, there is a simultaneous and steady pummeling of what remains of the healthcare infrastructure, including medical personnel. Consequently, access to health care is severely depleted in a time when it is most desperately needed. Mr. President, against the foregoing, Guyana wishes to again highlight the following. The war in Gaza must end immediately and without conditions. We reiterate our call for a ceasefire now. Israel, as the occupying power, must scrupulously comply with its legal obligations to ensure the well-being of the civilians in Gaza. It is illegal to deny the population sustenance and health care, and to take actions meant to physically destroy the population. The systematic confluence of factors to maximize the impact of the humanitarian hardships to which Palestinians are subject must be dismantled. The campaign against UNRWA, which culminated in the first instance in the passage of the October 28 legislation, is one such factor which the United Nations must do all in its power to confront. Finally, Mr. President, after a year of senseless killing and maiming, this war on Gaza has reinforced the fact that weapons of pain cannot produce peace, not for Israeli, certainly not for Palestinians, and not for the Middle East. To the contrary, the path to peace still remains the two-state solution, and circumventing this path will continually lead to a place of war and pain. It is time to end this cycle once and for all. Guyana is prepared to work with this Council to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais aussi remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe aux droits de l'homme, la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires d'OCHA, ainsi que le directeur du Bureau des urgences et de la résilience de la FAO, de leurs exposés qui sont au plus haut degré alarmants. Les informations que nous venons d'entendre complètent l'appel conjoint récent des agences des Nations Unies sur la situation humanitaire encore plus aiguë à Gaza et l'alerte du comité de la famine du PCI. Et c'est pourquoi mon pays, avec nos collègues de la Guyane, de l'Algérie et de la Slovénie, a demandé cette séance d'urgence et nous sommes reconnaissants au Royaume-Uni de l'avoir mis à l'agenda si rapidement. La Suisse remercie aussi toutes et tous les humanitaires qui poursuivent leur mission au péril de leur propre vie, alors que la famine menace Gaza, particulièrement dans le nord. En adoptant la résolution 2417, ce Conseil a reconnu le lien entre les conflits armés, l'insécurité alimentaire et le risque de famine. Ce faisant, il a également réitéré le devoir qui incombe à toutes les parties au conflit de respecter leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains, en particulier celles ayant un impact sur la sécurité alimentaire. Il y a près de 8 mois, ce Conseil s'était réuni dans le cadre prévu par la résolution 2417 suite à l'appel d'OCHA qui avait formulé des recommandations afin de sortir de la situation déjà terrible à ce moment-là. La mise en œuvre de ces recommandations est d'autant plus urgente aujourd'hui que l'insécurité alimentaire est devenue encore beaucoup plus aiguë. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par l'alerte du PCI qui fait état d'une famine imminente malgré les appels répétés aux parties du conflit. Celles-ci ont en effet l'obligation d'autoriser et de faciliter l'accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave à tous les civils dans le besoin. En tant que puissance occupante, Israël doit en outre faire en sorte, dans toute la mesure de ses moyens, que les besoins essentiels de la population gazaoui soient satisfaits. Il est important de rappeler que l'usage de la famine comme méthode de guerre est strictement interdit par le droit international humanitaire et constitue un crime de guerre dont les responsables devront répondre de leurs actes. Face à cette situation et en ligne avec les recommandations entendues cet après-midi et avec l'alerte IPC, la Suisse souhaite souligner les mesures urgentes suivantes. Premièrement, il est impératif et urgent qu'un accord de cessez-le-feu soit enfin conclu. Les résolutions 2728 et 2735 l'ont exigé. Nous appelons également à la libération immédiate et sans condition des otages. La Suisse est pleinement investie dans les négociations sur une ébauche de résolution proposée par les membres élus de ce Conseil. Deuxièmement, la Suisse appelle toutes les parties à prendre immédiatement des mesures concrètes et effectives pour épargner et protéger la population civile comme le requièrent leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Ceci comprend, je le répète, l'interdiction d'utiliser la famine comme méthode de guerre contre la population civile, l'interdiction d'attaquer, de détruire, d'enlever ou de mettre hors d'usage des biens indispensables à la survie de la population civile et l'obligation d'autoriser et faciliter le passage rapide et sans entrave des secours humanitaires destinés aux civils dans le besoin. Le personnel humanitaire doit être respecté et protégé tel que réaffirmé par la résolution 2730. Ceci inclut le personnel local, notamment de l'UNRWA et du CICR. Troisièmement, un acheminement des denrées alimentaires commerciales à toutes les zones doit être garanti afin que les marchés locaux puissent être rétablis. L'aide humanitaire à elle seule ne peut pas répondre aux besoins de plus de 2 millions de personnes. Dans ce contexte, la Suisse rappelle également le rôle central du personnel local des agences humanitaires et le rôle pivot de l'UNRWA pour la fourniture de services essentiels au-delà de l'aide humanitaire. Madame la Présidente, les données scientifiques présentées nous appellent à l'action. La Suisse, en tant que point focal informel au Conseil sur les conflits et la faim avec le Guyana, appelle tous les membres de ce Conseil à assumer leurs responsabilités, comme le demande la résolution 2417. Nous devons trouver une solution qui puisse enfin mettre fin à la souffrance humaine et nous devons urgemment relancer les perspectives de paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. First, allow me to thank you for convening this important meeting. I would also like to extend our appreciation to Mrs. Brandt-Keris, Mr. Paulson, and Mrs. Mitsuya for their insight on this critical issue. The worsening situation in Gaza, tragically, was foreseeable, with famine now ravaging the already suffering Palestinian population. Humanitarian organizations have repeatedly sounded the alarm, issuing urgent warnings as the international community remains unable to halt the oppression by the occupying Israeli forces. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, this aggression clearly illustrates the international community failure to enforce universally applicable rules. The catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is not incidental, but rather a consequence of a deliberate, man-made policy of deprivation imposed by the occupying power. As noted by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the right to food, and I quote, "On 9 October 2023, Israel announced its starvation campaign against Gaza. By December, Palestinians in Gaza made up 80% of the people in the world experiencing famine or catastrophic hunger. Never in post-war history had the population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely." End of quote. This chilling report underscores the gravity of the deprivation inflicted on Palestinians, particularly in northern Gaza, where people are literally dying from starvation, from famine. This is a clear use of starvation as a method of war, which constitutes a war crime. Madam President, today, words cannot capture the horror endured by civilians in Gaza, especially in the north. The intent behind these policies has become starkly clear. Empty northern Gaza of its inhabitants. This is not a mere speculation. It reflects an established, recognized policy openly acknowledged by Israel, systematically aimed at displacing Palestinians from this area. The Israeli Defense Forces have clearly stated that, and I quote, "Palestinians will not be allowed to return to their homes in northern Gaza." This stance blatantly violates UN Security Council resolution, including Resolution 2735, which guarantees the right of displaced persons to return to their home. To make this decision effective, on 6 October 2024, Israel decided the northern Gaza Strip a combat zone. ordering all civilians to evacuate. Médecins Sans Frontières reported that their staff are trapped in Jabalia, stating, and I quote, "Nobody is allowed to get in or out. Anyone who tries in getting is getting shot." During last month of October, civilians in northern Gaza have been under siege with no confirmed food deliveries. Those attempting to obtain aid have faced targeting. And the situation throughout the entire Gaza Strip is appalling. Despite repeated call from the international community, despite resolution adopted by this council, and despite the established UN mechanism, only 37 trucks entered Gaza per day during the month of October. May I recall that they were more than 500 last year. And this month of October saw the lowest level of humanitarian access to Gaza. And to make things worse, not a single authorization for import of commercial food has been issued by the Israeli authorities. Madam President, amid this crisis, the Israeli occupying authorities decided to halt UNRWA's operation in the occupied Palestinian territories. This constitutes another act of collective punishment against a Palestinian population entirely dependent on these services for survival, further compounding their suffering and denying them their right to life and dignity. The life of children, women, and the elderly, in fact, every civilian in northern Gaza, are at imminent risk. These people cannot be left to face alone an occupying Israeli power that disregards all rules and responsibilities concerning human lives. Let me remind you that the Israeli finance minister stated that, and I quote, "It may be just and moral to starve the 2 million residents in Gaza." End of quote. And we, as members of this council, must uphold our moral and legal obligations. The resolution put forth by elected members of the Security Council under the coordination of Guyana demands immediate adoption. There is no time to waste. The IPC report warns, and I quote, "Failure to respond to these calls within the next few days will result in a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation and additional, avoidable civilian death, end of quote. This Security Council must act now decisively to impose a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, and a permanent ceasefire to end the collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza and uphold our commitment to international humanitarian law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank the briefers, Assistant Brands-Kerry, Director Paulson, and Acting Undersecretary General Masuya. This meeting takes place in light of the latest Famine Review Committee alert for Gaza, with particular focus on northern Gaza Strip. It is not the first meeting we are holding on man-made hunger in Gaza. It is also not the first meeting on the man-made catastrophic circumstances in the North Gaza. A siege within a siege is unfolding, verging on the apocalyptic situation, as recently characterized by the humanitarian agencies present in theater. Protection of civilians is not a political issue. It is a non-negotiable principle. It is a legal obligation. We should therefore take this alert seriously, and I want to put it very straightforward. People in Gaza are starving. Women and men, from children to older persons, are hungry, while 100,000 metric tons of food awaits entry at different corridors around Gaza. Famine in Gaza is predictable, and it is, I repeat, man-made and preventable. The worst-case scenario, with the onset of winter and expected flooding in this low-lying coastal strip, looms over displaced population without basic shelter, surrounded by wastewater, solid waste, and debris. Demolished water facilities expose them to contaminated water resources and shatter local production of food. We fail to understand how one cannot feel the horrible pain of Palestinians in Gaza. As underlined by the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and as just recalled by my colleague from Algeria, never in post-World War history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and as completely as was the case for Palestinians living in Gaza. Man-made famine is a form of slow violence, causing lasting physical and psychosocial harm to survivors. It generates a social trauma which passes through future generations. More immediately, we are deeply concerned for this generation of children. Stories of children in Gaza unable to cry due to hunger should force us to act now. Their silence must be deafening for their families, their doctors, their communities. The only silence louder is the one of this Council, not acting to prevent the worst from happening. We call for full implementation of all 4 Security Council resolutions related to this war and all ICJ orders on provisional measures. We underline that starvation as a method of warfare is prohibited by international law. We reject all attempts to starve Palestinians in Gaza. More than a year into the war, we cannot accept assurances implying that everything possible is being done for protection of civilian population in Gaza. This is simply not true. The Security Council must demand urgent scaling up the delivery of humanitarian assistance to and within Gaza. The Council must demand urgent scaling up the delivery of commercial goods. The Council must demand full humanitarian access and appropriate space and safety to be granted to humanitarian organizations, both intergovernmental and non-governmental ones. The Council must demand rapid recovery of local food system and recovery of the WASH system. The Security Council must demand an unconditional release of all hostages. To use the words of briefers, time for Council's action is now, within days, not weeks. Colleagues, any effort to prevent famine in Gaza is inherently connected to the situation of UNRWA. This agency is backbone of humanitarian response in Gaza. Its collapse would have unimaginable consequences for people in Gaza. There is no alternative to UNRWA. There is nobody in Gaza that can replace UNRWA. This has been expressed very clearly by all UN agencies and humanitarian organizations, and again today by the briefers. We urge Israeli government to not implement the legislation recently adopted by Knesset. Madam President, this alert is a wake-up call. Failure to provide peace to Middle East cannot be an excuse to fail protecting civilians in the region. We have a responsibility to protect them. Humanitarian situation in itself has become a threat to international peace and security. And this Council must act on it with a clear decision for a ceasefire. Thank you.
Representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And thanks to Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia and Switzerland for requesting this meeting. I also thank the briefers for the briefing on the harrowing situation in the Gaza Strip. Malta is extremely concerned about the IPC's declaration of the strong likelihood of famine in the besieged northern areas of Gaza. Food systems have collapsed and aid deliveries are being withheld. This man-made famine is a result of direct actions by the Israeli government, and it is leading to the suffering of millions in Gaza. All told, we are facing a human rights crisis all throughout Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Today, the entirety of Gaza's population is facing emergency levels of food insecurity. Tens of thousands of people are being forcibly displaced from North Gaza in violation of international law. As recalled by the heads of UN agencies last week, the situation we are facing in the north is apocalyptic. The persistent actions undertaken by Israel to dismantle UNRWA's vital operations in the entire OPT will collapse the humanitarian response in Gaza and gravely exacerbate this catastrophe. We reiterate our long-standing and unwavering position. The agency is irreplaceable. It serves as a stabilizing force in the region and a vital source of support for Palestinians. It is the backbone of humanitarian assistance to generations of Palestinian refugees, and its work remains essential. President, the recommendations for immediate action made by the IPC must be heeded. Israel must allow immediate, unimpeded access for the delivery of adequate food, water, medical, and nutritional supplies into and throughout Gaza. The siege of northern Gaza must end. It must facilitate repairs to health facilities, water and sanitation infrastructure, and the passage of vital materials required to meet the basic needs of the population. These requirements are binding legal obligations and are neither arbitrary nor negotiable. They are in accordance with Israel's responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention and international humanitarian and human rights law. President, this Council has a responsibility to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security. Inaction and political paralysis are not an option. The world, especially the people of Gaza, are expecting us to rise to the obligations and responsibilities entrusted to us. the E10-led draft resolution will finally address the desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza and the immense suffering of the Gazan population by demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the release of hostages. It would also demand the Israelis' unhindered facilitation of humanitarian assistance at scale to the people of Gaza. This is the only pathway to averting this famine. There is no alternative. President, for more than a year, we have heard the UN, every humanitarian agency, and every human rights group sound alarm. What we are witnessing in Gaza is a defenseless civilian population sheltering in and around schools, hospitals, and aid distribution sites. They must be protected, and Israel's attacks against them should cease immediately. The situation is completely untenable, and there is no more time to waste. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President, for convening this important meeting. I would also like to thank ASG Karis, FAO Director Paulson, and Acting USG Msuya for their sobering and somber briefings. Since the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israeli citizens in October of last year and the ensuing massive military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces, the world has been witnessing numerous breaches of international humanitarian law. Hamas and other groups murdered innocent civilians and still hold 100 or so hostages, either living or dead. They are continuing rocket attacks on Israeli population centers, shielding themselves in Palestinian civilian infrastructure. But one party's non-observance, even if it is deemed to be a terrorist group, does not provide any legitimate ground for another party's failure to comply with international law for 13 months straight. Regardless of intent, when breaches of international humanitarian law happen, no justification can be given. Numerous times, the Council members have underlined that humanitarian aid must be ensured and starvation must not be employed as a method of warfare. And the IDF has repeatedly claimed it operates in accordance with international law. Let us be clear. Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention provides that the occupying power has the duty of ensuring the food and medical supplies of the population. Under the current situation, where Gaza is entirely controlled by the IDF, it is undoubtedly the obligation of Israel, not the United Nations, nor the remnants of the de facto regime in Gaza, to ensure necessary food and medical goods for Palestinian civilians. The IPC Famine Review Committee's alert last week, citing the IPC report in October, clearly shows that Israel is not doing enough, as famine is now imminent in the north. It is also extremely alarming that the entire Gaza Strip is classified in IPC Phase 4, an emergency level. Israel must protect civilians and permit entry of sufficient humanitarian cargo into Gaza. But its obligation does not end there. Israel should actively facilitate the delivery of aid throughout Gaza, and displaced civilians must be permitted to return to their homes as soon as possible. Thus, we condemn Israeli military officials' reckless and inflammatory rhetoric reported last week that, I quote, "No one will be allowed to return to the northern Gaza, and no humanitarian aid will be allowed there because there are no civilians left in the area," unquote. These remarks are clearly inconsistent with the current reality of northern Gaza, where numerous civilians have no choice but to stay as a result of injury, lack of safety, age, or no guarantee of security to move to other areas, following multiple displacements. Such remarks can also be read as an acknowledgement of violations of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which provides that persons shall be transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities have ceased. Any attempt at demographic or territorial change in Gaza, including Israeli politicians' call for resettling in Gaza, must be rejected. Madam President, in spite of the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council, the conflict in Gaza continues to be prolonged, and repeated violations of international humanitarian law have persisted. There should be no delay in ending the current conflict. Thus, the Republic of Korea strongly calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Hostages still held must be immediately released. This is the only way to guarantee mass delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza and to prepare a serious reconstruction plan. We hope another Council product to this end can be soon adopted and implemented. Lastly, we reiterate that there is no substitute for UNRWA. Without UNRWA, the entire burden would be borne by Israel to ensure all humanitarian aid and public services like health and education throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. IHL is clear. Israel, as the occupying power under the Geneva Convention, must seriously consider once again all their obligations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Le agradezco, Presidenta, por la convocatoria a esta sesión informativa y también doy las gracias a la subsecretaria Brand Keris, a la secretaria general adjunta en funciones Misuya y al director Paulsen por sus exposiciones informativas. El Ecuador, que con Irlanda copreside el Grupo de Amigos contra el Hambre y Conflicto, está profundamente preocupado por la situación de inseguridad alimentaria en Gaza. En febrero pasado mantuvimos una reunión en la que tratamos la crítica situación humanitaria por la que atravesaba el norte de la Franja de Gaza a causa del conflicto. Lamentablemente, y como lo evidencia la alerta emitida por el Comité de Revisión de la Hambruna, en los últimos meses la situación ha experimentado un constante y rápido deterioro, al punto que es posible que ya se haya superado los umbrales de hambruna o que esto esté próximo a ocurrir. Los factores que estarían precipitando una verdadera catástrofe humanitaria son el desplazamiento de la población civil a causa de las hostilidades, el colapso de los sistemas alimentarios, la destrucción de instalaciones de atención sanitaria y nutricional y otras infraestructuras civiles, así como las dificultades de operación de UNRWA. Las alarmantes estadísticas sobre los niveles de inseguridad alimentaria están configurando el peor escenario en el norte de Gaza, caracterizado por el hambre y una creciente mortalidad a causa de malnutrición y enfermedades que afecta principalmente a grupos vulnerables como mujeres, niños y ancianos. Ante la velocidad del deterioro de la seguridad alimentaria, que requiere una respuesta extremadamente urgente, el Ecuador respalda las recomendaciones planteadas por el Comité de Revisión de la Hambruna, que ponen de relieve el vínculo entre el hambre y el conflicto. Es en esa línea que mi delegación subraya los siguientes elementos. En primer lugar, el Ecuador insta a todas las partes a que adopten medidas concretas que permitan proteger a la población civil y para que respeten el derecho internacional humanitario, incluida la Resolución 2417. En segundo lugar, y como lo reconoce el informe de junio de 2024, la situación puede revertirse con el ingreso y distribución de suministros alimentarios. Por consiguiente, es urgente permitir el acceso de ayuda humanitaria e implementar plenamente las resoluciones 2712, 2720 y 2735. En tercer lugar, si bien las acciones dirigidas a atender las necesidades humanitarias de la población son esenciales y urgentes, el Ecuador insiste en que la paz duradera es la única respuesta sostenible al riesgo del hambre. El cese al fuego y la liberación de los rehenes son los primeros pasos hacia esa paz y deben darse de forma inmediata. Mi país continuará apoyando las iniciativas para alcanzar una solución pacífica negociada, definitiva y justa al conflicto, con la existencia de dos estados, Palestina e Israel, conviviendo en paz y seguridad. Para concluir, señora Presidenta, el Ecuador agradece a los trabajadores humanitarios por todos sus esfuerzos para aliviar las acuciantes necesidades de la población, a quienes se debe garantizar protección y seguridad a fin de que puedan desempeñar su labor. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Keris, Director Paulsen, and Acting USG Musia for their sobering briefings. Madam President, Japan is deeply disturbed by findings in the IPC Famine Review Committee alert and 6-month update report by OHCHR on the human rights situation in Gaza, both published on November 8, which highlight the catastrophic conditions in Gaza. The IPC alert is shocking, revealing the humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip is extremely grave and rapidly deteriorating, and the famine is highly likely to become imminent in northern Gaza. The OHCHR report also highlights by January 2024, starvation became a reality for Palestinians, particularly in the north, with the most vulnerable populations, such as infants and the elderly. The far insufficient flow of aid into northern Gaza over the past month is unacceptable. While we acknowledge Israel has reopened the Kisfim crossing today, additional urgent efforts are imperative to improve humanitarian access to the Strait. In this context, Japan reiterates its grave concern over the adoption by the Israeli Knesset of the bills imposing severe restrictions on UNRWA. The agency is absolutely essential for the delivery of humanitarian relief in Gaza in this desperate hour. We also understand the agency's full commitment to take further steps to ensure its neutrality, including through the implementation of the Corona report. Let us recall that Israel has been strongly encouraged, including by the ICJ, to fully cooperate with the UN to ensure unhindered provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. We are concerned about what the loss of UNRWA's functioning is expected to bring about on the grounds of the region. Israel's responses to the situation, including the adoption of Knesset bills, appear inconsistent with the obligations under international humanitarian law. Recalling Security Council Resolution 2417, we emphasize that starvation must not be used as a weapon of war, and deliberate mass displacement must not take place. Madam President, Japan remains steadfast and proactive in its commitment to provide support to the most vulnerable and has provided approximately $130 million in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people since October 7th last year. Japan also gravely alarmed by the OHCHR report outlining the human rights situation in Gaza, which includes accounts of civilian casualties, the use of human shields, indiscriminate projectile attacks, attacks on hospitals and humanitarian and medical workers, widespread displacement within Gaza, and hostage situations. Japan once again strongly demands the release of all remaining hostages and reiterates its unequivocal and strong condemnation of the horrific terror attacks and hostage-taking committed by Hamas and others on October 7th last year. We continue to repeat our unwavering demand that all parties to conflict must act in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law. Madam President, only an immediate ceasefire and the immediate release of hostages can end the catastrophe. All relevant parties must strive to bring a halt to the fighting without delay. Japan will continue tirelessly in its diplomatic efforts to that end. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢阿尔及利亚、圭亚那、斯洛文尼亚和瑞士倡议召开此次会议，感谢姆苏亚代理副秘书长、凯里斯助理秘书长和保尔森主任的通报。民以食为天，吃上饭，吃饱饭，这是人类的最基本需求。人道问题不能政治化，饥饿不能武器化，这是国际人道法规定的基本底线。然而，在持续13个月的加沙冲突中，平民的基本需求被反复剥夺，所有的人道底线被一再突破。两种组织 IPC 饥荒评估委员会最新报告发出警告，加沙人道物资准入降到了历史最低水平，人道局势十分严峻，而且还在迅速恶化。在北部加沙，一场严重的饥荒即将爆发。令人感到关切的是，这场灾难不是人类无法控制的天灾，也不是毫无预兆突然降临。在过去1年里，以色列持续对加沙狂轰滥炸，袭击医院、学校、难民营，切断食品、药品和燃料供应，反复大规模强迫转移平民，造成了前所未有的人道灾难和破坏。妇女儿童占到了平民伤亡的大多数。许多分析指出，在加沙限制和剥夺平民获得粮食的权利，是针对巴勒斯坦民众的系统性集体惩罚的一部分。在全世界众目睽睽之下发生这样的惨剧，是对人类良知和国际法治的拷问。必须指出，扩大对加沙的人道救援，最大的挑战不是人道物资供应不足，而是人道准入受到人为限制。国际社会向加沙援助了大量物资，只能在过境点外排起长队等待。我们敦促以色列立即开放全部过境点，切实消除人道物资进入加沙全境的障碍。卡格高级协调员根据安理会第2720号决议授权，推动加沙人道准入。我们期待他的工作取得实质进展。必须指出，加沙一再面临人道困境，并不是因为人道机构的努力不够，而是人道行动遭到重重设障。以色列一边限制人道行动，一边指责联合国和人道机构不作为，这不可接受。我们呼吁以色列同联合国等人道机构开展全面合作，保障人道机构的安全和便利。当前在这方面的一个突出问题是，以色列议会通过法案关闭联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处，这将切断加沙民众赖以生存的生命线。中方再次谴责任何打压和限制工程处的做法，有关法案必须停止实施，尽快撤销。必须指出，在加沙开展人道救援最欠缺的不是其他物资资源或政策条件，而是关键当事方的政治意愿。近期，世卫组织在加沙完成了脊髓灰质炎疫苗接种， 再次说明扩大人道援助是可以做到的。重要的是，以色列作为占领方，必须履行国际法义务，不能被允许将人道救援作为讨价还价的筹码。我们看到，每当国际舆论或个别国家的批评上升的时候，加沙的人道援助似乎就能取得一些进展。这反过来也说明，占领方并没有拿出全部努力，为缓解加沙的人道灾难，仍有巨大的行动空间。主席立即在加沙实现持久停火，尽快推动落实两国方案，是结束冲突、恢复和平的根本出路。中方呼吁以色列听取国际社会的呼声，停止在加沙的军事行动，停止对黎巴嫩等其他国家的侵犯。10个非常任理事国已经提出决议草案，要求在加沙立即停火，这符合当前国际社会对安理会的期待。中方欢迎10个非常任理事国的行动，支持安理会尽快表决通过这项决议。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Brans Keris, Acting USG Joyce Musea, and Director Ren Paulson for their briefings. Madam President, civilians have borne the brunt of the war in the Gaza Strip, with at least 43,000 people killed, over 100,000 injured, and nearly 1.9 million displaced, many of them repeatedly. Civilians have had their homes, schools, markets, and all semblance of normal socio-economic life destroyed. They virtually live in perpetual fear and constant deprivation. In the absence of a ceasefire, the men, women, and children caught up in this conflict have no safe refuge. International humanitarian law, including the rules of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, has been repeatedly challenged with no exception, no protection, and no respect for the rights and dignity of persons. The resolutions adopted by this Council since the onset of this cycle of conflict in October 2023 have all been aimed at preventing the devastating humanitarian impact of war. It is unfortunate that the fears that propelled the Security Council to adopt Resolution 2417 in 2018, that armed conflicts and violence have devastating humanitarian consequences, often hindering an effective humanitarian response, and are a major cause of the risks of famine, are tragically unfolding in the Gaza Strip, where the food systems have collapsed and humanitarian aid flows are at their lowest levels. Previous and current reports from United Nations humanitarian personnel and other partners emphasize the grim reality of death and suffering in the Gaza Strip, with October reportedly recording the lowest number of aid trucks entering Gaza since November 23 at 58 per day. This is a sharp decline from the approximately 208 trucks per day recorded in August 2024. Northern Gaza remains particularly at risk, with reports indicating that it is almost impossible to deliver food aid and supplies to its approximately 75,000 to 90,000 estimated residents. We are particularly concerned with the recent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC alert of 8 November 2024 that, quote, an imminent and substantial likelihood of famine is occurring in the Gaza Strip due to the rapidly deteriorating situation, end of quote. The IPC report has classified the entire Gaza Strip as an IPC Phase 4 acute food insecurity, with IPC Phase 3 levels of acute malnutrition in September to October 2024. The non-availability of food due to the halt of agricultural and economic activity, as well as the access constraints, mainly caused by insecurity, blockades, and other administrative and operational restrictions, have caused the IPC Famine Review Committee to conclude that, quote, starvation, malnutrition, and excess mortality due to malnutrition and disease are rapidly increasing in the Gaza Strip, especially in the north, end of quote. This assessment echoes the statement issued by heads of 15 UN and humanitarian organizations, including acting USG Musea, at the start of this month, that the entire Palestinian population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. Madam President, current happenings in the Gaza Strip violate all Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 2417, 2573, and 2730, that strongly call for the respect and protection of the civilian population, including humanitarian personnel and civilian objects. In this connection, we are deeply concerned that Qatar will pause mediation efforts for a Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deals until Hamas and Israel show a sincere willingness to return to the negotiating table. We therefore urge Israel and Hamas to demonstrate good faith and sincere willingness to recommit to the negotiations in order to agree to a ceasefire to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people. In seeking an end to this tragedy that is worsening day by day, Sierra Leone will engage and call for the following actions. First, we join the 15 UN and humanitarian organizations of the Interagency Standing Committee to reiterate the appeal for parties to the conflict to protect all civilians in the Gaza Strip as stipulated in resolutions 2417, 2573, and 2730. Second, we reiterate our call for the full respect of international humanitarian law that will allow for the unimpeded supply of food, water, medical, and other essential items to enter the Gaza Strip without further delay. Third, we emphasize the indispensable role of UNRWA, acknowledging the reliance of the entire humanitarian community on its extensive capacity and comparative advantages in providing daily aid and supporting accelerated food aid delivery to millions of Palestinians in the region. We therefore call on the State of Israel to reconsider its recent legislation and desist from actions that may impact the operations of UNRWA in the occupied Palestinian territory. Lastly, Sierra Leone reiterates its support for any effort or initiative by this Council that will demand an immediate ceasefire, release of all the remaining hostages, and the full implementation of all the resolutions adopted on this question since the 7th October 2023. Let us treat this subject with the urgency required to save lives and rescue succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, OHCHR Assistant Secretary General Kairis, OCHA Acting Undersecretary General Musuya, and FAO Director Paulson for your briefings. There's no need to mince words here. As we heard from our briefers, the situation in northern Gaza is dire, catastrophic, as we heard from Ms. Musuya. An unconscionable number of Palestinian civilians, many women and children, have been killed. And according to the latest assessment from the IPC, nearly every civilian in Gaza is without adequate food, medication, clean drinking water, or housing. They simply cannot be left to suffer indefinitely. As Secretary Blinken has emphasized, we need to end the armed conflict, bring the hostages home, including the 7 Americans held by Hamas, and chart a path forward in the post-conflict period that provides governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza. As we consider that future, we must immediately surge humanitarian aid to civilians throughout Gaza, or many of them may not survive the winter. The IPC's latest report on the prospect of imminent famine underscores the urgency of the situation, and it makes clear that such a surge is critical. The United States, too, has made clear to Israel that it must address the undisputed humanitarian crisis. So far, thanks to intervention by the United States, Israel has taken some important steps, including restoring aid deliveries to the north. Still, Israel must ensure its actions are fully implemented and its improvements sustained over time. Only a sustained flow of assistance, coupled with restoration of basic services, including health and nutrition activities, health care and water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure, can alleviate the catastrophic levels of food insecurity found in the IPC report. And we continue to reiterate there must be no forcible displacement nor policy of starvation in Gaza, which would have grave implications under U.S. and international law. Colleagues, UNRWA's role has been vital as the front line of this humanitarian response. The agency facilitates approximately 80% of humanitarian aid in Gaza. At present, it is indispensable. And so we repeat the urgent importance of Israel pausing implementation of legislation targeting UNRWA. However, let's be clear. The United States shares Israel's concerns that a small number of UNRWA's personnel were involved in the October 7th attack, and others have ties to Hamas and other armed groups. We're also concerned that some of UNRWA's facilities were compromised by Hamas, which is unacceptable. It is in no party's interest to have the neutrality of UNRWA personnel remain in doubt. We once again call on the Secretary General to facilitate an independent mechanism to review and address all allegations. But it should be possible to address these allegations while sustaining a vital lifeline to Palestinian civilians in need. Again, it is essential there's no interruption of humanitarian aid delivery. Colleagues, the work before us to forge a ceasefire is difficult, but it is necessary. The challenge of helping a revitalized Palestinian Authority rebuild Gaza without Hamas is immense, and the humanitarian crisis facing millions of Palestinian civilians is daunting. But these obstacles are not insurmountable, and we cannot succumb to inaction. We need to give Palestinians a future to look forward to with self-determination and security without Hamas being a part of it. We need Israel to feel secure within its own borders. We need to save lives, the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the lives of hostages who have now gone over a year since seeing their families, and the lives of generations to come, of Palestinians and Israelis alike, who deserve to live in peace. The United States will continue to work for a ceasefire and find a way to end the armed conflict so that hostages can return home to their loved ones. Palestinians and Israelis can live in security and peace. And we will continue to work tirelessly to surge life-saving assistance to those in desperate need. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I commend the UK's presidency for convening this briefing, and to Guyana, Switzerland, Algeria, and Slovenia for bringing this critical matter to the attention of the Council. We also thank our briefers, Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Rain Paulson, Director from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and Ms. Joyce Nsuya, Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, for their comprehensive insights highlighting the gravity of the situation in Gaza. Madam President, on February 27, 2024, this Council convened to address the imminent risk of food insecurity in Gaza after 4 months of conflict. Today, more than 12 months later, Israel military operations have created deplorable conditions across Gaza. Humanitarian organizations report that the prolonged siege of northern Gaza has rendered the area uninhabitable, and it is a heartbreaking situation which has now reached catastrophic proportions, necessitating immediate and sustained humanitarian intervention. Evidence strongly indicates that famine is imminent in northern Gaza. This development demands our most urgent attention and requires decisive and immediate action from this Council. Madam President, as we have consistently reiterated, the protection of civilians in armed conflict is a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law. It is therefore the responsibility of all parties involved in conflicts to ensure that civilians are safeguarded from harm. Failure to do so, it's not only a violation of international norms, but also morally reprehensible. As the Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Msuya, stated in one of our previous sessions, I quote, if it is to have any real meaning for the millions of civilians affected by the war in Gaza, it is time to go above and beyond compliance, to strive for the full protection of civilians against the full range of harms they are suffering on our watch, end quote. Therefore, the obligation to ensure civilian protection falls unequivocally upon all parties engaged in the conflict. And deviation from this principle constitutes not only a violation of international norms, but represents a fundamental moral failure to avert and alleviate this catastrophic situation. Immediate intervention is imperative from all parties directly involved in the conflict and those wielding influence over its conduct to prevent and mitigate this humanitarian catastrophe. In this context, the Council and Member States must mandate and ensure compliance with the comprehensive protection framework to alleviate the famine in Gaza Strip through the following essential actions. First, end the siege in the northern areas of Gaza Strip and the cessation of attacks on healthcare facilities and other essential civilian infrastructure. Second, implement an immediate and unconditional ceasefire to facilitate humanitarian aid delivery, including food, water, and medical supplies. This includes reopening border crossings to enable unhindered flow and efficient aid distribution. Third, apply a coordinated international diplomatic pressure to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law and to prevent the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Fourth, mobilize substantial additional funding and resources to support humanitarian operations in Gaza, including appeals to donor countries and international organizations, particularly those who have suspended their contribution to UNRWA, to re-engage and support relief efforts. Lastly, work towards long-term solutions to address the root cause of the crisis in Gaza, mindful of the fact that achieving sustainable peace and stability ultimately hinges on a political solution. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, признательны Алжиру, Гаяне, Словении и Швейцарии за инициативу по созыву сегодняшнего заседания Совета Безопасности в связи с катастрофической гуманитарной ситуацией в секторе Газа. Благодарим госпожу Бранскерис, господина Паульсона и госпожу Сую за обзор разворачивающейся на наших глазах гуманитарной катастрофы и оценку ситуации с обеспечением продовольственной безопасности анклава, особенно на его севере. Опубликованный на днях отчет Комитета по обзору за ситуацией с голодом фиксирует, что продовольственная система сектора Газа не просто не справляется, она рухнула. Население всего анклава, более 2 миллионов человек, по сути находится в состоянии чрезвычайной нехватки продуктов питания. Это 4-й уровень отсутствия продбезопасности по соответствующей шкале ООН, за которым следует самый настоящий голод и голодная смерть. Особую тревогу вызывают прогнозы о том, что уже в ближайшие месяцы на севере Газы ожидается повсеместный голод, и основания для таких оценок, к сожалению, имеются. В этих условиях армия обороны Израиля продолжает безжалостную военную операцию, причиняя мирному населению новые страдания. Палестинцы, которые смогли уцелеть под регулярными артобстрелами и авианалетами, вынуждены постоянно перемещаться по анклаву в поисках пропитания и убежища. Те, кто не успевает покинуть территорию, из которой Цахал объявляет очередную эвакуацию, оказываются в ловушке. По сути, отстающимся мирным газовитянам предлагается умереть либо от голода, либо от артобстрелов и бомбардировок. Об этом прямо говорят представители гуманитарного крыла ООН, включая руководство ВОЗ и БАПОР. При этом все происходящее в Газе – часть целенаправленных усилий властей Израиля по созданию так называемой буферной зоны безопасности. Подобные действия израильтян мы сейчас наблюдаем и на юге Ливана, где в результате тактики выжженной земли гражданское население лишается средств к существованию, а затронутые районы, в том числе сельскохозяйственные, превращаются в полностью непригодные. Госпожа председатель, отказываясь прекращать свою карательную операцию против палестинских женщин и детей в Газе, Израиль еще и продолжает, несмотря на многочисленные призывы со стороны международного сообщества, ограничивать поставки гуманитарной помощи. Нет никакого смысла считать количество работающих погранпереходов, потому как даже если какие-то из них формально функционируют, их пропускная способность крайне незначительна. Данные на сегодняшний день это наглядно иллюстрирует. Речь идет о самом минимальном объеме завозимых гуманитарных грузов в анклав с момента начала военной операции. Среднесуточная норма всего 58 грузовиков, что ничтожно мало в контексте текущих потребностей. И данное чудовищное гуманитарное положение сложилось практически через год после принятия резолюции Совета 2720, призванной наладить и облегчить доставку помощи в Газу. При этом специальный механизм старшего координатора ООН по гуманитарным вопросам и восстановлению в Газе Сигрид Кааг так и остался на бумаге. Тем членам Совета, которые периодически говорят о неких положительных результатах работы госпожи Кааг, стоит признать, что ее усилия, какими бы активными и благородными они ни были, не принесли желаемых плодов. И это очевидный факт, который сложно оспорить. И на этом фоне израильские власти принимают решение об объявлении БАПОР и его сотрудников вне закона. В условиях, когда альтернативы агентству просто нет, такие действия можно расценивать не иначе, как антигуманные. При этом очевидно, что Израиль, как оккупирующая держава, не выполняет свои обязательства по международному гуманитарному праву и самостоятельному обеспечению защиты гражданского населения на подконтрольных территориях, снабжение гуманитарной помощью, в том числе продуктами питания. Теперь же газовитян еще и лишают единственного международного спасательного круга, замены которому попросту не существует. Деятельность БАПОР представляет собой не только распределение гуманитарных пайков среди нуждающегося населения. Агентство на протяжении десятилетий осуществляло важнейшие задачи в области налаживания системы образования и медобслуживания, социальной защиты и инфраструктурного развития. Подрыв этой структуры приведет к самым серьезным социально-экономическим последствиям для всего региона. Осуждаем решение Кнессета и призываем безотлагательно их пересмотреть. Госпожа председатель, обратили внимание, что упомянутый ранее комитет по обзору за ситуацией с голодом адресовал свои выводы и рекомендации о необходимости предоставления беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа, снятия блокады северных районов, прекращения атак на гражданскую инфраструктуру не только сторонам конфликта. В отчете содержится призыв к заинтересованным участникам, имеющим влияние на конфликт. Коллеги, думаю, все прекрасно понимают, о каком государстве прежде всего идет речь. Жаль только, что эксперты, готовящие такие публикации, как и представители ООН в целом, не говорят прямо о том, что именно у США имеются все возможности для того, чтобы способствовать прекращению кровопролития. Для этого, как минимум, американские представители должны перестать блокировать решения Совета Безопасности по прекращению боевых действий и вместе со всеми недвусмысленно потребовать от израильских властей налаживания полноценного и беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа к пострадавшим и нуждающимся. За год с лишним, прошедших с момента трагических событий 7 октября, потакающий Израиль и Вашингтон должен разделить с Западным Иерусалимом вину за гибель более 43 тысяч палестинцев, в том числе от исправно поставляемого в регион американского оружия, а также умерших от голода и от инфекционных заболеваний. Госпожа председатель, уважаемые коллеги, в сложившихся обстоятельствах Совет Безопасности обязан как можно скорее выйти из состояния паралича, в котором он стараниями Соединенных Штатов пребывал последние месяцы под неустанные мантры о грядущем заключении сделки между Израилем и Хамасом. Если бы Западный Иерусалим был готов к договоренности, он бы на нее давно пошел, а не выдвигал бы все новые условия, а израильские официальные лица на всех уровнях не говорили бы о намерении покончить с Хамас раз и навсегда. Скажем прямо, наши американские коллеги сознательно водили нас всех за нос, выигрывая для Израиля время для реализации его планов по истреблению как можно большего числа палестинцев в Газе и превращению этой территории в абсолютно непригодную для жизни зону. Пришло время действовать. Именно поэтому Россия выражает полную поддержку подготовленному десятку непостоянных членов Совета Безопасности проекту резолюции по Газе с прямым требованием о немедленном, безусловном и постоянном прекращении огня и освобождении всех заложников, и призывает его к постановке на голосование без дальнейшего промедления. Принятие этого документа стало бы запоздалым, но верным шагом к прекращению бойни, выводу палестино-израильского конфликта из сложившегося тупика и прологом к перезапуску мирного процесса на общепризнанной международно-правовой основе, включая двугосударственное решение. Другого пути для того, чтобы на Ближнем Востоке наступил справедливый и устойчивый мир, не существует. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je remercie Yilborn Keris, Monsieur Paulsen et Joyce Moussouya de leurs exposés. Le Conseil de sécurité doit réagir face à la catastrophe humanitaire en cours à Gaza, où la situation continue de se détériorer. Le dernier rapport du comité d'examen de la famine alerte sur la forte probabilité que la famine soit déjà présente ou imminente pour les populations du nord de Gaza. Ces informations appellent une mobilisation immédiate. En 2018, ce Conseil adoptait la résolution 2417 qui condamnait pour la première fois l'utilisation de la famine comme arme de guerre l'absence d'accès humanitaire et la privation des civils de biens indispensables à leur survie. Cette résolution s'impose à Israël comme à tous. Les blocages imposés au nord de Gaza doivent être levés sans délai. L'ensemble des points de passage doivent être réouverts et l'aide humanitaire livrée de façon sûre, massive et sans entrave. La France appelle Israël à assurer la protection de tous les civils et toutes les infrastructures civiles et rappelle que tout déplacement forcé de population constitue une violation grave du droit international. Face à l'urgence humanitaire absolue, les agences des Nations Unies jouent un rôle indispensable, y compris l'UNRWA. La France déplore l'adoption par la Knesset des lois portant sur l'UNRWA et appelle Israël à respecter ses obligations internationales vis-à-vis de l'UNRWA et des Nations Unies. Elle réaffirme son plein soutien à l'UNRWA, sans qui des centaines de milliers de Gazaouis n'auraient pas accès aux soins les plus élémentaires et à son indispensable réforme. L'UNRWA apporte de l'aide humanitaire par elle-même, mais sert aussi de plateforme pour que les autres organisations humanitaires puissent le faire. Madame la Présidente, la France condamne les attaques terroristes et les violences sexuelles commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023. Elle rappelle son attachement indéfectible à la sécurité d'Israël. Tous les otages doivent être libérés sans délai. Seule la fin de la guerre permettra d'éloigner durablement la perspective de la famine à Gaza. Il est donc urgent de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent dans la bande de Gaza. C'est la seule solution pour mettre un terme au désastre humanitaire qui se déroule sous nos yeux. La France, en lien avec ses partenaires, poursuivra ses efforts visant à mettre fin à ce conflit et à mettre en œuvre la solution des deux États. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, the State of Palestine thanks Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland for calling for this very important and timely meeting. We also want to express our appreciation to the three briefers for their for sharing with us the stunning facts about the horrifying reality of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, especially in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Madam President, the very survival of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians is at stake, notably in northern Gaza. They are being killed and starved to death, moved around like cattle from one place to another, from one death to another. According to OCHA, the most represented category of age among those killed are children, notably from age 5 to 9, and newborns to 4 years old. And there are kids maimed, disabled for life, amputated, orphaned, starving, traumatized. There is no regard for children's lives or civilian lives, no regard for international law or the most basic rules of humanity. There is a brutal, barbaric war against the Palestinian people, unrelenting, inhumane, criminal attack against every shred of life and all the requirements of life in the Gaza Strip. This council met a year ago, and it was already clear what trajectory we were on. We knew then that we were on the path that leads from mass killings to genocide, from starvation to famine, from mass bombing to wanton destruction, from evacuation orders to forcible displacement, from so-called military operations to annexation, from the risk of regional escalation to the certainty of regional war. The agony of the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, instead of ending, is now coupled with the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, with no regard for the sanctity of civilian life and for the sovereignty of Lebanon. Everything we warned against, everything Israel denied, is happening before our eyes. We are at the last stages of an orchestrated plan to empty wide areas of Gaza from its Palestinian population and to inflict upon the Palestinian civilian population conditions that would lead to its destruction if it refused to leave. Let us all pause and understand what it means that northern Gaza is facing now famine, while aid is available and is only a couple of miles away. Let us pause and understand what it means that Israel has decided and implemented famine as a method of war for the purposes of ethnic cleansing and to advance its colonial objectives. Israel tells us trucks are entering and crossings are open and markets are flourishing, or blames others for the siege it is imposing, while the UN, humanitarian NGOs, and all states around the world are saying the opposite, that aid is not allowed in, and when allowed in, is prevented from reaching the people that need it, that starvation has prevailed by design, that forcible displacement is taking place. Who should be believed? Will I have a solution? Israel, which has been killing Palestinian journalists, 182 of them that we celebrated the other day in Geneva in a conference, killing Palestinian journalists to stop them from reporting under false pretext, can allow the international media into Gaza to report on who is responsible for what, on the real conditions in Gaza, on the magnitude of this human-made, occupation-made catastrophe. But Israel will not, because it knows that what the international media will report will provoke a moral and political earthquake. They come and lie to the media and the stakeout outside, but they refuse to allow the media to go and report for itself the facts, and we are grateful for all UN agencies and the briefers who are with us for telling the facts as they are and the lies of the government of Israel and their representative. Nowhere is this more true than northern Gaza, where Israel considered that there are no civilians left and that all those who remained became military targets, justifying killing them and starving them to death. Never before in our international law-based order had any country claimed that an entire civilian population, children, women, and men, was a legitimate military target. Never again. Never happened. Madam President, the ICJ issued clear provisional orders to address what it characterized as a real and imminent risk for the right of the Palestinian people to be protected from acts of genocide. Can anyone around this table argue that Israel has not been deliberately and totally in breach of these orders? What are the implications of such a breach over months? It seems obvious that what was a real and imminent risk then is a terrifying reality now. What we need now is what we needed all along: an unconditional, immediate ceasefire. Let me say it again: an unconditional ceasefire and the immediate entry of life-saving assistance, especially to the north. We need the release of hostages and of Palestinian prisoners. We need the return of people to the areas from which they were displaced, alongside a tremendous effort for immediate relief and reconstruction. We need full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and initiatives towards an end of occupation and shared peace and security. It should be noted that families of hostages and prisoners, and that bereaved families, Palestinian and Israelis, are calling for a ceasefire because they know it is the only way to save lives, the only way for families to be reunited or to be able to mourn. Let us not speak in their name to justify more killing. Let's not speak on their name to justify more killing. Listen to them. Let us not use them as pretext for further violence and parade them in the United Nations for the wrong reasons. Violence is an impasse. Our region has witnessed enough wars to know it. Madam President, 76 years ago, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were dispossessed and displaced, finding themselves refugees in tents. They needed everything, food and shelter. But the first concern of our parents was education. For decades to come, the world would speak of the Palestinian nation, who founded schools in tents and gave the region and the world one of the most educated people on earth, providing teachers to numerous countries and bringing up generations of doctors and artists and engineers. In that endeavor, UNRWA was and remains crucial. In the terrible loss and pain and suffering our people are enduring today, as the genocide continues unfolding before our eyes, with the aim once again to uproot our people, and while hunger and famine are tearing their organs apart, our people are still concerned that a generation of Palestinians have missed a full school year and may miss another. They ache as they see their schools and universities blown up, as they understand Israel is destroying their hopes after having destroyed their homes. The rights of Palestine refugees to return and their status is not subject to the existence of any agency. So if Israel thinks that by trying to destroy UNRWA, it can get rid of this issue, it is mistaken. Our right to return is a cornerstone of our rights, and it is rooted in international law. The Israeli legislation aiming to destroy UNRWA at the time it is most needed is both an attack against the United Nations and against the Palestine refugees it was created to serve, and against the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, who are facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Creating more despair, attacking the agency that helped refugees free themselves from want will not resolve anything. It will fuel the fire we are trying to desperately to stop. Madam President, this is it. Everything we feared is here. The only question that remains is, will we do anything differently now? Smotrich, who has a tendency to spell out clearly what is the policy of the Israeli government, is openly advancing annexation, allowing himself to speak to the intentions of the incoming US administration. We trust that his assumptions are wrong and that unlawful annexation will be opposed by all. The Palestinian people are faced with death, dispossession, and displacement yet again, but once again, they will not disappear. We will not disappear. We are rooted in our land as the olive trees, we call them the Romans, that are rooted in our soil. Only a just and peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine will lead to shared peace and security in our region, as reiterated by the Arab leaders at the Arab Islamic Summit held in Riyadh yesterday. The Arab world has once again shown that it is responding to occupation with demands for freedom, to annexation, to extremism with moderation, to war with initiatives for peace. The opportunity position adopted by the Arab world offers, despite the bloodshed, should be seized, not ignored. The alternative is what we see today. It requires courage, a clear vision, and a strong will to change this reality. And given the stakes, it is worth it. We stand ready to work with all of those who wish to put an immediate end to this war and to the full-fledged assault against the Palestinian people. All those who want to see an end of the Israeli occupation and conflict to allow the Middle East to unleash its true potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples of the region and the world. But it all starts with stopping the bleeding in Gaza. Enough bloodshed, enough suffering, enough horrors. Save lives now, or we will all have to live with the terrifying consequences. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine for their statement.